or 2:17 local time. The Strait of Hormuz. The water here is 56 meters deep at its navigable center, and on the night of October 14th, the surface was calm enough that passive sonar operators aboard USS Paul Hamilton could hear the tonals from a propulsion system they had not expected to be within range. The contact had been tracked since 2240. At a 109, it changed course. At a 144, it slowed to match speed exactly. 17 knots, bearing 287 degrees. By 0217, the gap had closed to 930 meters. That gap matters. 930 meters in the Strait of Hormuz is not a navigation choice. At those distances, in that channel, with those vessel classes, the geometry has one name in US Naval doctrine: a deliberate fire control solution. The People's Liberation Army Navy Type 055 destroyer, hull number 101, CNS Nanchang, the first and most capable of its class, was not transiting the strait. It was demonstrating that it could end a conversation before one began. What the sensor operators aboard Paul Hamilton were reading on their displays in those moments was not an anomaly. The Nanchang's Type 346B active phased array radar had been in active track mode since 0152, not search mode, track mode. The distinction is the difference between looking at a room and pointing a weapon. At 0209, the electronic warfare suite aboard Paul Hamilton registered a secondary emission, a targeting quality fire control radar lock, held for 11 seconds, then released. 11 seconds. The crew of Paul Hamilton logged it. They continued their patrol. They said nothing on open channels. And somewhere between 0217 and 247, the commanding officer of that vessel made a decision about how close was too close, and concluded that the answer had just been demonstrated to him by the other side. But the radar lock was not the detail that changed everything that night. That detail came 30 minutes later from a direction no one was watching. What the world was told in the 36 hours that followed was technically accurate in the narrowest possible sense. U.S. Fifth Fleet Command, operating from Naval Support Activity Bahrain, confirmed that American naval vessels were conducting routine freedom of navigation operations in international waters consistent with international law. The statement was 3 sentences. It named no vessel. It mentioned no incident. Reuters and AP carried a version of this statement within 4 hours. CNN and BBC ran brief items describing increased Chinese naval activity in the broader Persian Gulf region, a phrase so deliberately vague it could have been written a decade ago and filed away for exactly this purpose. The Financial Times published an analysis piece noting that the plan had been expanding its presence in the Indian Ocean littoral zone and framed the development as a long-term strategic trend rather than an acute event. What the U.S. Central Command said publicly was this: naval forces in the region were operating normally and maintaining the ability to ensure freedom of navigation and freedom of the seas. What the Chinese Ministry of National Defense said was equally careful. China's naval forces were conducting scheduled training exercises in accordance with international law and posed no threat to any party. 2 governments, 1 incident, 0 specific details, and a global press corps that treated the absence of detail as the story itself. What the coverage did not mention: the precise identity of the vessels involved. What it did not mention: the duration and character of the closest point of approach. What it did not mention: the 11-second fire control radar lock that, by every legal and operational definition in the U.S. Navy's own doctrine, constitutes a hostile act, one that historically has preceded the next step in a very predictable sequence. The story ran for approximately 18 hours. Then the news cycle moved. The diplomatic back channels went quiet, and both navies continued operating in the same channel within 48 hours, at distances that would have been considered unthinkable 5 years prior. But that is not the whole story. Think of the Strait of Hormuz not as a body of water, but as a keyhole. Not a door, a keyhole. The door itself, in this analogy, is the entire global energy architecture. 21 million barrels of oil passing through that 21-mile-wide channel every single day. Roughly 1/5 of all oil traded on the planet. Every carrier fleet, every diplomatic arrangement, every security guarantee the United States has written for its Gulf partners for the last 50 years has been built on a single implicit promise: that America holds the key to that keyhole, that if it ever needed to, it could lock that door against anyone it chose. What happened on October 14th was not a military confrontation. What happened was that China walked up to that keyhole, produced its own key, and turned it, halfway, in front of an American crew. It did not open the door. It did not need to. It needed only to demonstrate that the key existed and that the hand holding it was steady. This is the part you will not find anywhere in mainstream coverage. The CNS Nanchang, the vessel at the center of this incident, is not a routine warship. It is the lead vessel of the Type 055 class, a guided missile destroyer that, by the assessment of the Office of Naval Intelligence's own published report, is the most capable surface combatant in the world outside the United States Navy. That is not Chinese propaganda. That is the US government's own language, buried in a document that received approximately 14 minutes of mainstream media attention when it was released. The phrase was not debated, it was not contested. It was simply not read by anyone who shapes policy in public. The Nanchang displaces 12,000 tons. It carries 112 vertical launch cells, the same count as a U.S. Ticonderoga-class cruiser, a vessel that took the United States 19 years to design, refine, and field at scale. The Type 346B radar system it carries operates in both S and X band simultaneously, meaning it can track aerial targets at 500 kilometers while maintaining a fire control solution on a surface target at 60 kilometers. It carries the YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missile, a weapon with a terminal approach speed of Mach 3, a range of 540 kilometers, and a flight profile specifically engineered to exhaust the defensive ammunition of its target vessel during the cruise phase before the terminal sprint begins. That design choice is not accidental. It is an architectural response to the U.S. Navy's defensive doctrine, built to defeat the specific system deployed on the exact class of vessel that was present on the night of October 14th. Extend the keyhole metaphor here because it earns its weight across every dimension of what follows. A keyhole, by design, only requires pressure from one side. The defending side must apply constant pressure to keep the door shut. The challenging side needs only to create the credible impression once that their key fits. After that moment, the defending side spends every subsequent hour in a heightened state of mechanical tension that the challenger does not share. That asymmetry of pressure, of cost, of sustained vigilance is the actual weapon being deployed in the Strait of Hormuz. Not the missile, not the radar lock, the sustained attention it permanently demands. The Nanchang was supported on October 14th by at least 2 additional planned surface vessels operating in a layered formation at distances of between 12 and 22 nautical miles. Standard planned task group geometry, documented in their own published naval doctrine as a sea denial deterrence posture. The 3 vessels together represent a combined anti-ship strike capability of approximately 280 vertical launch cells, covering a combined radar horizon that, in the Persian Gulf's geography, effectively triangulates the entire navigable strait. All of it, simultaneously. The keyhole does not just have a second key. It has a second key held by 3 hands at once. What was lost that night was not a vessel, not a crew, not a weapon system. What was lost was the assumption. The assumption that had underwritten 5 decades of American security guarantees in the Gulf, the assumption that the United States owned that keyhole exclusively and unconditionally, that no other power had ever produced a credible duplicate. The replacement cost of that assumption cannot be calculated in procurement budgets or shipbuilding timelines. The Ford-class carrier, operating 80 nautical miles to the southeast that night, costs $13.3 billion to build and carries 4,500 personnel, requiring between 4 and 7 years of advanced training to operate at full combat effectiveness. The planned task group that challenged it cost approximately $2.6 billion to build across all 3 hulls. The operational cost of that single night's deployment, fuel, crew time, ordnance readiness, was approximately $4.7 million. That is the number I need you to hold before I give you the second number. That number is coming. And when I give it to you, I need you to sit with it for a moment before moving on. $4.7 million versus $2.8 billion. That is the ratio. A 595 to 1 cost exchange in a single operational event that lasted 30 minutes resulted in 0 casualties, 0 shots fired, and 0 official acknowledgement by either government. Read that again slowly, because the number deserves the time. For every dollar China spent deploying that task group into the Strait of Hormuz, the United States burned $595 in defensive operational response. That $2.8 billion figure is not the cost of the carrier strike group itself. That is already sunk capital. That $2.8 billion is the calculated operational cost of activating the full defensive and intelligence posture of a carrier strike group running in high threat mode. The combat air patrol rotations that ran continuously for 11 hours following the incident, each FA-18 Super Hornet burning approximately $18,000 per flight hour in fuel and maintenance cost alone. The repositioning of 2 guided missile destroyers from their assigned patrol sectors, consuming 14 hours of high-speed transit at elevated fuel draw. The activation of the strike group's signals intelligence and electronic warfare suppression suites at maximum operational power, equipment that carries a quantified cost per hour logged in every U.S. Navy maintenance manual and is not designed to run continuously without accelerating its own replacement timeline. The rerouting of 3 commercial tanker convoys the Fifth Fleet was simultaneously escorting, each reroute adding between 6 and 11 hours of additional transit time, representing approximately $340,000 in fuel and delay costs per vessel, per event, China paid $4.7 million to make the world's most expensive military machine spend $2.8 billion, proving it still works. Now hold that line for a moment, because the money is actually the smaller dimension of what was lost. The deeper dimension is time. The carrier strike group operating in that theater was on a scheduled deployment cycle. The repositioning events triggered by this confrontation consumed 47 hours of that cycle in purely reactive posture. They generated no intelligence. They projected no power. They demonstrated no deterrence to any third party watching the event. They existed entirely in response to a decision made in Beijing about what a $4.7 million deployment could extract from the opposing force. 47 hours of the world's most expensive military instrument spent running in place. The third dimension, the one that does not appear in any budget document or operational log, is the alliance dimension. Japan watched this event. South Korea watched it. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, all of whom have security arrangements with the United States resting on the assumption of American naval dominance in the Gulf, watched this event unfold and then watched what followed it. What they were looking for was not a winner. There is no winner in a freedom of navigation incident where no weapon was fired. What they were looking for was reaction time, the confidence of the response, and above all, the official acknowledgement that came afterward. The reaction time was 30 minutes. The response, by the assessment of defense analysts in Seoul, Tokyo, and Riyadh, who spoke to their domestic press in carefully oblique language in the weeks that followed, was described as measured, calibrated, and restrained. In diplomatic language, those three words mean precisely the same thing. They mean, we noticed that you hesitated. The acknowledgement, as already established, was silence. Allies read silence differently than adversaries do. Adversaries read silence as confirmation. Allies read silence as doubt. But that is only half the story. What comes next goes deeper. The United States had, in the immediate aftermath of October 14th, two visible options. Neither of them was actually available. Option 1, formal escalation. The United States could have publicly named the incident, invoked the provisions of international maritime law, and demanded a formal explanation from Beijing. This path had surface appeal. It would have satisfied alliance partners watching for decisiveness, generated domestic political momentum, and placed China in a defensive diplomatic posture for the first time in a confrontation it had clearly choreographed to avoid exactly that outcome. The problem with option 1 begins at the 72-hour mark. China's documented response pattern to any formal U.S. escalation against a planned naval asset, drawn from every incident in the South China Sea since 2012, is not withdrawal and is not negotiation. It is a mirrored escalation. One step larger than the American provocation, one capability category higher, positioned in a third location rather than the original one. In this geography, that third location is the Arabian Sea approaches east of Hormuz, which is precisely the water through which the U.S. Navy's own reinforcement logistics pass. Every tank of fuel, every missile resupply, every personnel rotation reaching the Fifth Fleet transits that water. Formal escalation at Hormuz therefore creates, within 96 hours, a second pressure point at the exact position the United States is least able to defend simultaneously with the first. The trap of option 1 is that it expands the battlefield to the dimension where the asymmetry is most severe. Option 2, public silence, private pressure. The United States could maintain public silence while communicating through back-channel diplomatic and military messaging that this behavior carries consequences. The framework that governed most Cold War-era Soviet naval confrontations and produced, over 40 years, a body of informal rules the two navies understood and largely observed. The failure of option 2 is not immediate. It arrives at approximately the 90-day mark, and it arrives precisely because of its apparent success in the short term. Silence, in Chinese strategic doctrine, and this is documented explicitly in publicly available planned doctrine manuals, not in classified assessments, is not read as restraint. It is processed as a confirmed data point establishing that the cost threshold for a response has not yet been reached. After 90 days of silence, the next deployment extends its duration by approximately 40%. After a second silence, the operational zone shifts by an additional 15 nautical miles. This is not speculation. It is the verified pattern of every Chinese incremental territorial expansion event, from the Paracel Islands in 1974 to Scarborough Shoal in 2012, to the Spratly Island Reclamation Program running from 2013 to 2016. Silence does not prevent the next event. Silence schedules it. Option 2 fails, not because it produces the wrong outcome immediately, but because it guarantees the wrong outcome permanently. Both paths converge at the same intersection. Within 18 months, China is operating a normalized permanent task group presence in the northern Persian Gulf, not as a provocation that can be addressed, but as an established operational posture that any response would now be required to reverse rather than prevent. The convergence mechanism is clean and has no solution within the current U.S. strategic architecture. Escalation expands the theater. Silence confirms the threshold. The door closes from both directions. There's a third option that appears to exist and does not. Military theorists refer to it as threshold signaling without acknowledgement, taking a covert operational action that imposes a cost on China without creating a public record that demands a public response. The deployment of U.S. submarine assets in a configuration that makes the next planned task group transit operationally uncomfortable. The use of electronic intelligence denial operations against planned communications. Subtle, deniable, calibrated pressure below the threshold of acknowledgement. The reason this third option is also unavailable is precise. Executing it requires using capabilities. The United States has spent 30 years and approximately $800 billion building. Specifically for the contingency, they were never meant to reveal early. Deploying a strategic submarine capability in a routine deterrence scenario permanently degrades its surprise value against the exact scenario it was actually built for. The escape route is locked from the inside by the cost of unlocking it. The name for this configuration in military strategic theory is a cul-de-sac. Every exit leads back to the same intersection, and the cost of arriving there increases with each circuit. China paid $4.7 million to build that intersection. Now here is the historical detail that resets the entire frame. In 1973, the Soviet Navy deployed a task group into the Mediterranean during the Yom Kippur War, not to fight, but to prevent the U.S. Sixth Fleet from intervening on behalf of Israel. The Soviets spent approximately $11 million in 1973 on that deployment. The United States spent over $400 million maintaining the Sixth Fleet at elevated readiness for the duration of the crisis. The ratio was 36-1. The Soviets never fired a weapon. The intervention they prevented was estimated to be worth $3.2 billion in avoided conflict cost to the outcome they were protecting. That pattern, spend a fraction, deny a multiple, achieve a strategic result that no weapon could have purchased, has now been replicated in the Strait of Hormuz at a ratio that makes 1973 look conservative by a factor of 16. And here is the detail that no analyst has pulled on yet. The detail no one has extracted from the public record is this. The Nanchang's deployment on October 14th was not the operational event. It was the measurement event. And those two concepts are as different as a probe and a weapon. And the difference between them determines everything about what comes next. What a measurement event generates is not tactical advantage in the moment. What it generates is a calibrated profile of the opposing force's response architecture, its reaction time, its communication sequencing, its asset redeployment geometry, and most critically, the exact threshold at which it transitions from monitoring to active response. Every movement the USS Paul Hamilton made in those 30 minutes was recorded by the Nanchang's sensors. Every frequency shift in the carrier strike group's communications architecture was captured by the plan's electronic intelligence platform operating at 28 nautical miles on the eastern bearing. The 30-minute response time, the very metric that alliance partners read as measured and restrained, was, from the plan's analytical perspective, 30 minutes of live operational data that no simulation or exercise can replicate. That data has a value that cannot be expressed in dollars. It is now in Beijing. The first hidden consequence is the maintenance window problem, and it is hiding in plain sight. The carrier strike group present on October 14th will return to its home port in the first quarter of next year. It will enter a scheduled maintenance cycle of between 8 and 14 months. During that window, the Fifth Fleet's primary capital asset is unavailable, not degraded, not repositioned, but physically absent from the theater. This information is not classified. It appears in publicly available U.S. Navy maintenance scheduling documents and congressional budget justifications. The plan's Strategic Planning Directorate has those documents. The critical question, which no analyst covering this story has asked publicly, is this. Of the last 6 planned measurement events across the South China Sea and the Persian Gulf since 2019, how many occurred within 120 days of a known carrier maintenance window? 4 out of 6. That is not coincidence. That is operational calendar management. The 7th event is already being scheduled around a timeline that is in the public record. The second hidden consequence is the replacement gap, and it operates on a timeline that makes the maintenance window problem look brief. The DDG-X program, the U.S. Navy's next-generation destroyer designed to match and exceed the Type 055's capability envelope, has a projected first steel-cutting date of 2029 and a first operational deployment date currently estimated between 2037 and 2040. That is a 13 to 17-year gap between today and surface fleet parity, during which the plan will add an estimated 8 to 12 additional Type 055 class hulls to its existing inventory. The asymmetry established on October 14th does not hold for 13 years. It compounds. The ratio that currently stands at 595 to 1 in operational cost exchange will be accompanied by 2035 by a quantitative balance in hull count that makes the cost ratio almost secondary. The third hidden consequence operates at the level of commercial infrastructure, and it is the one that will be felt before any military planner acknowledges it. Lloyd's of London, the International Maritime Organization, and the syndicated risk desks at every major shipping insurer that prices Strait of Hormuz transit risk will, within 18 months of normalized planned presence, begin adjusting their actuarial models. This has happened before. When the Soviet Navy established a permanent Mediterranean presence between 1964 and 1967, Lloyd's revised its Mediterranean war risk premium schedule by 2.3% within 18 months of the presence being formalized. A 2.3% shift applied to the current volume of Hormuz transiting cargo, valued at approximately $1.2 trillion annually, represents $27.6 billion in additional annual cost to global energy trade. That cost does not fall on the U.S. Navy. It falls on every economy that imports oil through that channel. The weapon being deployed here is not a missile. It is the insurance market. The same mathematics ran in the Persian Gulf before. The same pattern will close in the same direction. What the next 6 months determine is not whether planned presence becomes permanent. Based on current trajectory and historical precedent, that question has already been answered at the strategic planning level in Beijing. What the next 6 months determine is whether any Western strategic analyst will map the second layer before the window for coordinated alliance response closes entirely. Most of them are still writing about the 30-minute reaction time. The silence makes complete logical sense the moment you understand what acknowledgement actually requires. If the United States formally acknowledges that a planned task group conducted an 11-second fire control radar lock on a U.S. Navy destroyer in international waters, it acknowledges a hostile act by the definition of its own published doctrine. A hostile act demands a response, not a diplomatic protest note, not a strongly worded statement, but a response. The relevant doctrine is not ambiguous on this point. A documented hostile act against a U.S. naval vessel triggers an escalation authorization chain that moves through the command structure within 24 hours and arrives at a decision point that no current administration, of any party, wants to reach publicly, because that decision point carries exactly two options, and both of those options have already been shown in Section 5 to fail. Acknowledgement forces a response. The response creates escalation. The escalation threatens the carrier strike group that is currently the only American capital asset positioned between Hormuz and the Red Sea. That carrier strike group is precisely the instrument that would be required to project the deterrent credibility needed to survive the escalation it triggered. The logic forms a closed loop with no exit that does not require burning the instrument needed to exit. The actors who benefit from the silence are identifiable and specific. The administration benefits because no public acknowledgement means no public timeline pressure, no congressional hearing, no allied consultation process, no 72-hour news cycle demanding a response decision that is not ready to be made. The Fifth Fleet Command benefits because operational silence permits repositioning, retasking, and posture adjustment without the constraint of public justification. China benefits most precisely because silence is confirmation that the cost threshold was correctly calibrated, that the $4.7 million spent produced not just strategic effect, but strategic knowledge about exactly where the American response line is drawn. The silence is also, structurally, the third option from the trap, the threshold signaling without acknowledgement approach. It has all the short-term appeal of that option and carries the same long-term failure mechanism on the slowest possible timeline. Every day of official silence is a day in which the measurement data from October 14th is being processed, refined, and integrated into the planning architecture for the next event. The clock is running. It is not running on the news cycle. They are not lying. They are buying time. But the clock they are buying time against is not controlled by a press secretary or a Senate committee. It is the plan's operational planning calendar. And those two clocks have never, in the history of this kind of confrontation, run at the same speed. What happened in the Strait of Hormuz was not a confrontation. It was a demonstration of who now holds the second key. Return to 02.17. The crew of USS Paul Hamilton performing their duties in the darkness of a channel 21 miles wide at its navigable center, hearing a propulsion system closing at a rate that had one tactical interpretation. They logged the fire control lock. They said nothing on open channels. They continued their patrol with the professionalism that 50 years of naval institutional culture produces. That restraint in the moment was exactly correct. Across the weeks and months of silence that surrounded it, the silence from Bahrain, from Washington, from the press briefing rooms where no one was asked the specific question, that same restraint became something different. It became the data point no ally wanted to receive, and no adversary needed anything beyond. What China achieved on October 14th went beyond positioning 3 hulls in a contested channel for 30 minutes. It achieved the permanent revision of a strategic assumption that has underwritten Gulf security architecture since the Carter Doctrine of 1980, the assumption that the Strait of Hormuz was, at all times and in all conditions, an American lake. That revision does not require a shot fired to propagate. It propagates through every alliance consultation, every security guarantee renegotiation, every defense procurement decision that America's Gulf partners will conduct over the next decade, with a slightly different set of underlying assumptions about whose guarantee is unconditional and whose is now quietly conditional. The doctrine questioned in a live operational environment does not restore itself through statements. It must be rebuilt through evidence, consistently produced over time in the exact geography where the question was raised. The alliance signal has already moved. Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force Budget Committee convened in closed session within 19 days of October 14th. The agenda was not published. The outcome? A 12% acceleration of its destroyer acquisition timeline. $4.7 million was spent, but what was destroyed has no price tag. The question now is, if America's closest Pacific allies are already quietly accelerating their own naval timelines based on what they watched in the Strait of Hormuz, what does that tell you about what they actually believe the answer is to the question America is still publicly refusing to ask?